Actually, it occurred to me, I should say, since I'm here in the audience here, with Dr. Butler, Professor Butler at Ohio State University, it occurred to me when I was applying for a project that people might find it useful to know the changing values of animals and objects, as well as the nature of deaths throughout England. So I decided to start a third side project, which has as its goal the collection of some basic information for every entry of accidental deaths in plea rolls. And this information includes the name of those who died, how they died, the animal or object that killed them, the value of the object, and any interesting notes about the matter, such as if the animal or object was falsely valued or concealed, or if people tried to switch the animal, as you'll see happens. So since starting this project, and I should say it's still very much in its infancy, I've collected information on over 1,000 different cases from 20 different counties between 1218 and 1257. And I can mention these afterwards in questions if people want to know, but I won't mention them now. So now, as I just said a minute ago, most of this information is boring, it's terse, it's repetitive, but such information can, when combined and examined together, reveal valuable details about expectations in record keeping, local procedures pertaining to cases of accidental death, and also I should say homicide, because they could treat these as a homicide until it's actually determined that it's a case of misadventure. The accountability of coroners and sheriffs, it can tell us a lot about changing values of animals and objects in a variety of regions throughout a variety of periods. And peasant living standards as well. It can tell us a lot about peasant living standards in everyday life in 13th century England. Now, my goal today is to transform what has often been boring and repetitive for me to collect into an interesting and informative depiction of accidental deaths and Deodans in England between the years roughly 1218 and 1257. And I'll also briefly discuss how the study of accidental deaths and Deodans can shed light on the English government's attempts to increase its control over localities through its checks and balances at royal visitations, which are known as airs in this period. So first, I'll describe the Deodans and the procedures for identifying and collecting them. Then I'll identify some problems with studying Deodans, and then finally, I'll get into just a few usages of Deodans for understanding life in 13th century England. And I really do welcome any comments you have. So please help me with, if you can think of anything that I can add to this, I would love to hear it. So to begin with, what is a Deodand? Well, a Deodand, it comes from the Latin quite literally, to be given to God. And it's the animal or object that has in some way or other caused a person's death, or sometimes many people's death. And this animal or object would be valued, and after a visitation of royal justices to the county, the value of the object would be taken by the crown with the supposed intention that it would be donated to some charitable organization or some person. The early history of this practice seems to stem from early medieval practice in which the animal that killed a person would be given to the family of the person who the animal had killed. However, I don't know exactly when the English government claimed and started to exercise control over the collection and donation of the value of animals and objects that killed people. And this is something I plan to look into this summer. So what's the process for collecting these Deodans? Well, for every unnatural death, that is, for every case of misadventure, the coroner had to be summoned, and he, along with the 4 nearest villages, would hold an inquest over the dead body. Now, the early 13th century legal treatise, known as Bracton, states that inquiry must be made as to who was present when the said persons were drowned, crushed, or died without warning, and then let the bodies of those deceased be viewed naked and uncovered in order to determine whether the matter is a felony or a case of misadventure. All those present at the death ought to be attached until the coming of the justices, and let the boats from which such persons have been drowned be appraised, and any other objects which are the cause of death and are Deodans for the king. So basically, first they identify the cause of death. And this is crucial, and the importance of this can't really be overstated, because you can't have a Deodand if it's a homicide. So before you can actually have a Deodand, it has to first be demonstrated and confirmed by a coroner that the death was a case of misadventure. not a homicide. So the body has to be viewed by the coroner and the neighboring villages. It cannot be buried before the coroner has an opportunity to view it. Otherwise, those who buried the body would be put in mercy. That is, they would be put at risk of having to pay a financial penalty. Now, they do this. This happens, for instance, in a 5-year period in Kent in the 13th century. This happens at least 206 times. So people will bury bodies without allowing coroners to view them. And this could mean that there are homicides concealed behind them. We don't know. But it's a problem, obviously. And so if it's a case of misadventure, the coroner really does want to see the body to ensure that it is a case of misadventure. After this, witnesses are identified and attached, meaning they have to find sureties, usually 2 sureties, who will guarantee their appearance at trial before royal justices. And it doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman, witnesses have to appear, they have to find sureties. And then in a case of misadventure, the object that has caused the death is identified and valued, and this is the Deodand. Then later, potentially many years later, when justices visited the county, jurors from every 100 would provide the justices with a document called a veredictum, that is their truth sayings. Among other things, it had to contain every single case of misadventure, along with the value of the object that caused the death, if there was one. Any lie or misrepresentation of facts resulted in villages and people being put in mercy. Now, justices compared this veredictum from the district in a shire, so be it, again, 100 or a wapentake, they compared the 100 jurors' verdict to the sheriff's roll and the coroner's roll, and it's from this information that justices heard about all accidental deaths and Deodans since their last visitation to a county. And the result of all this information, the documents and this discussion, was transferred onto plea rolls, which is from where we get most information on Deodans in 13th century England. It's worth noting, however, that not all accidental deaths were recorded in plea rolls. For instance, Tiverton Hundred's veredictum from Devon in the 1238 heir, it contains a case in which, and I quote, Nicholas, son of Alger, was found drowned in the river X. This record was given to the justices, and the details of the case would have been discussed at the judicial proceedings. However, the case does not appear in the justices' records. The clerk decided not to record it in the justices' plea roll. And this is because justices' clerks did not always include cases if there was no money to be taken. In other words, if the case wasn't a case of accidental death and it didn't result in any money being paid, then the clerks might not record the case because they didn't have a need to. It says a lot about how I view these records, obviously. Fortunately, for my purposes, clerks would have recorded cases when Deodans were mentioned. Now, justices could ask for objects deemed to be Deodand to be brought to the court. And it seems this wasn't done often, or at least we don't read about it often. Nevertheless, there are cases in which justices put people in mercy for failing to bring before them objects ranging from 6 oxen in one matter, a knife upon which a boy fell, a horse, even a mill wheel. Here's an interesting case. Interesting to me, I should say. Whenever I say interesting, I mean interesting to me, for the record. So in this case here, John Joy was crushed by a mill wheel, and he died immediately. The first finder comes. He's not suspected, nor is anyone else. The judgment is misadventure. The price of the wheel is 26 pence, for which the sheriff is to answer. And then it tells us that the tithing of Alexander Lick does not have the Deodand before the justices. Therefore, it is in mercy. Now, again, I don't think justices required that they see Deodans all the time, but this is interesting because not having a Deodand before justices was something for which people could get in trouble. And now, interestingly, you can also see from this case the requirement that both sheriffs and coroners include in their records all cases of misadventure mentioned in the county court. Not doing so resulted in them having to pay financial penalties. So again, this is from the 1248 Berkshire heir. And you can see here at the end that it's testified that this was presented at the county or the county court, and nothing about it is found in the rolls of the coroner, nor in the rolls of the sheriff, therefore to judgment against them. So you can see that justices really are able to see what's happening at the local level, and they can actually compare these records to get at what actually happened. Now, cases such as this one aren't actually typical, though. There's a lot of detail in this. So what do they usually look like? Well, here are three typical cases, and we will come back to these, but I'll just mention them briefly here. The first one's from Yorkshire in 1218, and it says a certain boy was crushed by a wagon through the stupidity of those who led it. No one is suspected. The judgment is misadventure. The value of the wagon and the 2 oxen is 11 shillings, for which Robert de Percy ought to respond. And then in the second case, we see that Richard Nevitt, this is in Yorkshire from 1257, Richard Nevitt was riding his horse along the River Balder, and through excessive drunkenness, he fell from his horse into the water and drowned. Richard's son Alan, the first finder, appeared and is not suspected, nor is anyone else, and the value of the horse is 5 shillings, for which the sheriff is to respond. And then finally, we have Walter, son of Walter Mule, here in a record from Herefordshire from 1255. He fell between 2 horses and was struck by both, such that he died. The value of the horses is 8 shillings, for which the sheriff is to respond. And the 12 jurors, I got both. I have the, there we go. Sorry, I have the screen of people's faces over this, and I couldn't actually read the record. And the 12 jurors made no mention of the said Deodand in the roll. Therefore, they are in mercy. So, going back to the first of these cases here, a certain boy was crushed by a wagon in Yorkshire through the stupidity of those who led it. No one is suspected. The judgment is misadventure. The value of the wagon and 2 oxen is 11 shillings, for which Robert de Percy ought to respond. Well, this is an interesting case, this first case, because it's strikingly close to homicide. It seems that those in control of the 2 oxen and the wagon caused the death, caused the cart to crush the boy. And this is something that we can't really get behind the records to see in these situations. The discussion about what was said and what was not homicide when people were clearly at fault, such as in this case. I will say, though, that if you are interested in looking at intent and mens rea, I highly recommend Elizabeth Papp Kamali's Felony in the Guilty Mind in Medieval England. It's a spectacular book. For our purposes in these sorts of cases, it's very difficult to actually see, you know, what justices or a coroner would deem to be homicide and what wouldn't. In this case, they're saying that the stupidity of those who were leading a wagon killed the boy, but they're not being charged with homicide. So, the second thing I will say is we don't know who owned objects that killed people often. Sometimes we can identify if people owned objects that killed them. We can see, for instance, suo in records here. So here are 3 cases with horses. The first one where you can see Robert, who falls from his horse, de equo suo. In the second case, and we'll come back to the second one, which is from Kent in 1241, you have Lucas the merchant, and he falls from his horse. And then in the third case, you have Roger, who falls from his horse. Now, the third case is very interesting because the suo is superscript. So this is something that the clerk clearly thought was important enough to include in the record. Nevertheless, we still can't know if suo actually means they owned the horse or if it's just used to indicate the horse that the person who died was riding. For instance, I can picture myself in Mexico right now or in Jamaica riding a horse on the beach, and if through excessive drunkenness I fell off my horse and died, they would say, you know, a Canadian through excessive drunkenness fell off his horse and died. It doesn't mean I own the horse. And so you can see the problem. In other words, we don't know who owned the animals or objects usually. But I think in these sort of cases, I think it does actually mean when we see suo, it does mean that they were owned by the person who fell from them in these cases with horses. Also, when the Deodand is appraised, it's valued with objects that weren't mentioned at the start of the entry. And so back to the first case again in 1218 in Yorkshire, where the boy is crushed by the wagon through the stupidity of the people who led it. You find right here, so it just says wagon first, but then it tells us that the price of the wagon and the 2 oxen is 11 shillings. And this is a problem because if you're trying to find the value of objects, it's very difficult to do that when they're lumped together. And this happens a lot. So in Northamptonshire, for instance, in 1253, we see here that Geoffrey falls from a certain cart filled with hay, but the price of the cart and the horse and hay is 14 shillings. So again, we can't separate those objects to see what they're potentially worth. It's very useful, and I'll say this again later. It's very useful for seeing, what people are doing, how they're living, gender roles, how people are dying as well. But if you're trying to get at the value of an object, it's very difficult, obviously, or impossible when they're lumping them together. And you can see this as well, for instance, from Norfolk in 1250, where two people fall from a boat into the river. And then it says here that the price of the boat with the fish on it is 3 shillings. So again, you can't really, it's very difficult to get at the value of fish. You don't even know what type of fish they are. It's difficult to get at the value of the boat. You can't help wonder, though, the person who owned the boat, or who, the people who did the fishing, you couldn't have fallen off the boat and died when we didn't have the fish on it. You kind of wonder how many people would have thought that. That's a crude thing to say, I know, but I digress. And then finally, Roger here, in this final case, you can see a value of an object added afterwards that's separately. I'll just say what it is. So usually the records state only the total value, as I said, not the value of each animal or object. But there are exceptions. Sometimes, for whatever reason, clerks valued objects separately. And so in 1257, you can see this here where they're saying that the horse and cart are valued separately. The horse is valued at 20 shillings. The horse that is on the cart is valued at 20 shillings. But the cart itself is valued at 4 shillings 6 pence. And I'll just briefly mention as an aside, because it's often, I usually find it important to remember this. These are real people, and this is one of my favorite images, actually, from a medieval manuscript. Not just because this guy here has a lightsaber, but it's one of my favorite images because you can really see just the effort that people are putting into, for instance, moving hay, and you could see just the danger involved in this and how you could easily die. And, what would be valued in this case if the person fell under the wagon and it crushed the person to death? Would it be the wagon? Would it be the horse? Would it be the hay? Would it be all of them? So that's the first thing. In the second case that I mentioned at the start, when I had the 3 cases, the case of Richard Nevitt, this is from Yorkshire, again, 1257. He fell through excessive drunkenness from his horse and he drowned. What's important about this is really what Maitland had said over a century ago, when he commented on this sort of information not appearing in records often. We don't see in 13th century plea rolls for Deodans, or for entries involving Deodans or homicide, that excessive drunkenness is the reason for it. But it's quite possible that there are many cases where you could add through excessive drunkenness to the entry and it would be accurate. And so just keep that in mind. And then finally, the third case that I'd mentioned from Herefordshire in 1255, where Walter falls between 2 horses and he's struck by both so badly that he died. So in this case, the first thing to note is that the jurors made no mention of the Deodand in their rolls. You can see that right here. The 12 jurors made no mention in their roll concerning the Deodand. What does this mean? Well, we've already talked about how each district, such as 100 or wapentake, had to present to royal justices a written account of all cases of misadventure, noting if there was an animal or object responsible for the death, and if they left anything out, they would be penalized. Put in mercy, that is. And to be put in mercy meant to be at risk of paying a financial penalty. Jurors and villages are frequently put in mercy for concealing or falsely valuing Deodans. And sometimes it's clearly done on purpose. Other times it isn't. Returning to a case that I mentioned earlier, this is the case from 1241 with Lucas the merchant who falls from his horse. You can see here that the jurors originally presented that the horse was a Deodand valued at 4 shillings. And then later, you can see that it said that the horse had a saddle. There was a saddle and a harness on the horse. And so the jurors are put in mercy for not mentioning this, or to be more specific, for concealing this detail, it says. And interestingly, this case provides us with a separate valuation for the saddle and the harness. So when justices find out that localities have done something wrong or they've forgotten a part of a deodand, those are fantastic cases for me, because then you usually do see a separate value of the deodand. So I like it when they get in trouble. Interestingly, as I said, it gives you a separate valuation, but one of the things that I think it's important to remember is I don't think that it's common for people to be riding on horses with saddles and harnesses, particularly ones that are worth this much money. And we certainly don't see it in the records for Deodans. It's not mentioned usually that people have saddles on their horses or there's a harness with the horse when it dies that's valued. These are probably, if they do exist, they're probably not worth much, and they're just bundled up with the value of the horse. Now, in this case, with the death of Lucas from 1241 in Kent, it could simply be a case of jurors innocently not including the value of the saddle and the harness. But other cases show clear attempts to actually hide or change deodans. And this is a case here from Norfolk in 1250, showing just how sometimes people will swap a lesser valued object for a more expensive one for a lesser value object. I think I said that the right way around. So at the 1250 air in Norfolk, the justices discovered that a man had fallen off a horse worth 10 marks. But the horse that they valued as Deodan at the time was worth only half a mark. And this is, I think, obviously done on purpose. It's a fascinating case. We don't have time to go into it. But what's really interesting about this, super interesting about this, is the decision to falsely value, conceal, or change Deodans didn't really change anything financially. In short, if every Deodand was falsely valued, there would still be only one amercement levied against each village. And this is because villages were only amerced once at heirs, regardless of the number of times that they were put in mercy for their actions or inactions that contravened what was actually supposed to be done. So there was no motivation to actually report or adequately value each Deodand accurately beyond what they felt was the right thing to do. And this is really important. Shameless self-promotion. I'll put up my article, which actually stems from a talk I gave at the center here in 2015. Limits of Strong Government Attempts to Control Criminality in 13th Century England. I talk about this, about amercements and people being amerced only once and what it means. Why this is important is it's important because the government at this time is really struggling to try to supervise and control the procedures of justice, the procedures of law at the time at the local level. And it really shows that at the time, I think, that it was much more important, the symbolic element of justice was much more important than the actual financial penalty. As I've said elsewhere, I think the penalties that they would pay for doing this, we can see clearly it's not that much. They're only penalized once, regardless of how many times they do it. So you could have every village across England for an heir fail to summon a coroner, not come to an inquest, bury a dead body, falsely value Deodans, do any number of things, and they could do it repeatedly, and they would still only be penalized once, and the penalty would likely be somewhere between 10 shillings and 12 shillings. So again, it shows that it's the symbolic aspect of actually being told you've done something wrong, which then acknowledges that the government actually has the right to supervise this. But really, whether it changed people's actions is hard to determine. I'm still looking into this. And I'm happy to talk about this in questions afterwards, obviously. Now, what happened to these Deodans? Well, they're supposed to be given to a church or some charitable organization. And to be sure, this sometimes did happen. Henry Summerson notes that after the 1268 Wiltshire heir, the king gave the newly founded Merton College in Oxford the money raised from the sale of the Deodans. And sometimes impoverished people, in particular the parent of a child who died, who had been killed by an animal or object, impoverished people would be given the Deodand. And here's a good case of this, where you find John, son of Christiana of Welney, fell from a certain boat into the river Welney. Again, this is from 1250 in Norfolk. He drowns, the first finder appears, and she is not suspected, nor is anyone else. The judgment is misadventure. And then we read in the record that the value of the boat is 12 pence, for which the sheriff is to respond, and it is given to Christiana's mother because she is poor. And it's interesting that in the record you can see it's already been crossed out. And so they will give money, they will give the value of the object to a poor person. In this case, I really do not think that the boat belonged to this woman. I think it potentially belonged to someone else. But I can't prove that, obviously. Sometimes justices also gave Deodans to lepers or a church. And when they did this, it was usually the value of a single Deodan. So not Deodans from the entire heir, as had happened, for instance, at the Wiltshire heir. That's not common, or at least I don't think it's common. They would usually just give the single Deodand. But there's actually very little evidence indicating that the money always made it to some charitable organization. It has, however, been pointed out to me, and I think it's a fair criticism, that I've been too cynical at hinting at Deodans being collected and kept by kings. It seems they usually would have been given to a person or some institution. There are, for instance, at least 3 plea rolls that have lists of Deodans attached to them. And these lists are important. I should say, first of all, they're attached in the same way that amercement rolls are attached. So at every heir, when the justices visit, the 100 jurors, so you have, say, a shire, say if the justices are visiting a shire, every 100 has to produce a veredictum. And so every 100's veredictum is collected, and then the information in that is compared with the rolls in the coroner's rolls and the sheriff's rolls. And the information from these records is collected, really, or is summed up in a sense in plea rolls. So justices' clerks are recording what's happening at the heir, and it's the information from those 3 records that really makes it into the plea rolls. And then afterwards, they'll tabulate all of the fines, the amercements, and they'll put this in an amercements roll. We have these, many of these exist. Well, in 3 cases, we also have attached to the roll list of Deodans from Buckinghamshire in 1232, from Kent in 1227, and from Warwickshire in 1232. 2 of the 3 Deodan lists actually indicate the person or the institution to which the value of the Deodand is given. But what's unclear is if it's the justices who are actually deciding where the money went. I'm still looking into this. Now, I hope that when I finish with plea rolls, I'll be able to find more evidence of this in other types of records. And if anyone can think of anything, I'd love to hear it. Now, occasionally Deodans would be pardoned. As I've mentioned, I've mentioned impoverishment already, but there are other reasons that might result in a Deodand not being taken. And I'll give you 3 examples to illustrate this point and see if you can figure out from these 3 examples which was pardoned and which 2 were not pardoned. So one of these was pardoned. So in 1256 in Northumberland, we hear that a justice's clerk at the 1256 heir recorded that Gilbert Colt was leading a wagon filled with wine, and surprise, surprise, Gilbert got excessively drunk. He fell under the wagon and one of the wheels crushed him. And then it says, the wagon, wine, and oxen were. Well, what do we think happened? Well, we'll come back to this. The second case here in Surrey in 1255, Thomas Corpicum fell from a boat loaded with brushwood and coal and drowned. And then we find that the brushwood boat and coal, they're deemed Deodand. I wonder what happened in this case. And then we go to the third case, and it says that in 1241 in Surrey, or from the 1241 Surrey plea roll, it says that Peter Red fell from a ship and drowned, and the ship was carrying the king's wine. And the ship and the wine were what? Well, obviously you can see in this case, it's the third case. The king's wine, that's not going to be Deodand, so that's pardoned by writ of the king. It says nothing concerning this because it's pardoned by writ of the king. In the other 2 cases, the Deodand is listed. So in the first case, it's valued at £5, 8 shillings, 8 pence. And in the second case, interestingly, the Deodand is valued separately. The boat's valued at 6 shillings, and the brushwood and coal are valued at 1 mark. So you can see that situations can arise that are totally unrelated to poverty in which Deodans are pardoned. Now, one final problem I'll mention is that the records seldom give any indication of the size, age, or quality of the Deodand. So consider horses, ladders, and boats. So here's a a record from the 1241 heir in Kent. And you can see 3 cases here. I hope you can see all 3 of them, where a horse is involved in a death. The first one, the horse is valued at 5 shillings. In the second one, the horse is valued at 6 pence. And in the third one, the horse is valued at 2 shillings. Now, you can get an idea from what they did, perhaps, whether or not it's a big horse, a young horse. Sometimes they can be called a small horse, but for the most part, it's very difficult to actually know, what is an average horse from these records. And I think household accounts might actually help with this, but for the time being with plea rolls, it's very difficult to see, why is this horse valued at this level, as opposed to ladders, for instance. So here are 2 cases from Buckinghamshire, right after the other. The first one, where someone falls from a ladder and dies, the ladder is valued at 3 pence, and in the second one, it's valued at 1 penny. I think this is clearly related to, the size of the ladder, what the ladder is made up of. I think also, though, you can put these sort of together and get an idea of what an average ladder might cost or might be worth if say, someone wanted to purchase one, or if we wanted to know what a ladder would cost. Finally, boats. Boats are terrible for understanding values. Here are 4 cases from Yorkshire in 1218. In the first case, you have a boat worth 6 pence. That's steam Deodand. In the second case, it's worth 4 shillings. In the third case, it's worth 6 pence. And in the fourth case here, it's worth 12 pence. These are very different valuations, and there's no clear indication, for the most part, when you're looking at these, of why they're valued differently. There are obvious indications, though. In this case, where the boat's worth 4 shillings, it's not just one person who falls off the boat and died, so it could be bigger. But you get my point. It's very difficult to actually come at to understand reasonable values for, say, a boat or a horse when the range of values is so wide and you don't have really any indication of why they're being valued so differently. Nevertheless, sometimes records do reveal more information. So here's a gruesome example. 3 piglets came to Thomas's house, and there they, with their teeth, dragged to death Thomas's son, Thomas. The piglets were valued at 18 pence, for which the sheriff is to respond. So I think this, particularly when you look at other cases where it mentions a piglet and it's valued at around 6 pence, I think you can use these sorts of cases to come to figures for, what would a piglet cost, say 6 pence. You can also look at, how terrible this would be. I won't go into this, although I know some people do watch my talks for the pig and bear and bunny comments, but I'll move on. There are other examples too, where it'll say small boat or small horse, as I said, but usually this isn't the case. So now getting into a little more detail, and I'll limit my work here for the years to the years 1254 and 1257 mostly, just because that's I've examined all the records from there, and it's a useful range of dates for showing what I want to show. Useful and easy. The records show many people dying by misadventure, but only 508 Deodans are mentioned for the plea rolls from those years at my last count. I should say my figures still might change, so don't quote me on these figures, please, right now. So first, on how people died. What's the most dangerous animal in England? Now, I know what most people think. Most people think the most dangerous animal in England is the bunny. We've all seen this. It is not actually the bunny. If you do have any records of a bunny killing someone or being a Deodand, I would love to hear of it. Or anything like the images like the Arthurian romances. The bunny is not the most dangerous animal. What is the bear? We know that in 1252, Henry III was given a white bear by the King of Norway. And it's possible that this and other bears were shipped to England through Norfolk. For some time between 1250 and 1257, a certain small bear, Ursiculus, bit a man, from which wound he died 3 days later. And the bear, later called an Ursus, not Ursiculus, was valued at 2 shillings. This is from the 1257 heir in Norfolk. Now, I'm not sure. I originally thought, maybe there's some time between the valuation, and so, it's a small bear that bites Herman, and then by the time it's valued and the coroners come, it's a bigger bear, or they just call it an Ursus. I don't really think that anymore. I think the clerk is just being lazy. So it's just a small bear that's brought over. The bear. Now this is going to sound weird. The way that I'm phrasing this. The bear is the only animal that kills with intent all the time for the records I have. This is one of the ways I've started to look at Deodans. One of the ways is how dangerous is the animal, as opposed to, say, someone falling off a horse or someone falling off a cart. How dangerous is a horse in terms of if it wants to kick someone, or how dangerous is a bear if it wants to attack someone? So how often when we find records of accidental death involving an animal, is it because the animal is doing something as opposed to someone else, say, falling off a horse? And what I found is that, first of all, pigs are the most dangerous animals, I would say. If I've learned anything from reading plea rolls in the 13th century, it's that you just should not leave pigs alone with children. They like to eat children. If you're reading about Deodans as well, you'll also read a lot about boats, carts, and horses and mill wheels. These objects, if we move out of the realm, the sort of ridiculous realm that I was in right there of, how the most dangerous animal, what animal kills people mostly as opposed to people dying from falling off an animal. Looking at just objects, what objects are involved in deaths the most? And these are the 5 objects from 1254 to 1257 that are involved in the most deaths. So this is how they figure. Out of the 508 cases that I have from 54 to 57, 37% of them involve horses, 16% involve boats, 15% carts, 12% mill wheels, and 9% cooking pots or vats for brewing. And so this is interesting, particularly when you start looking at the records, who's finding these people, and along the lines of the work that people such as Barbara Hannawalt has done, really understanding what's happening in everyday life. You can use these records to do this. It's also interesting, though, to use these records to really just see what they are valued at. And as I said, and you'll see again, horses and boats, it's very difficult to come to a valuation, but other things, you can really get a good idea of what they were worth at the time. Now, I think someone will, if they look at this, I think there's 11% missing. I'm aware of that. That's the bear and the pigs, the ladders, the nets and whatnot, which I didn't include. So now that I've demonstrated some of the animals and objects that kill, I'll mention a few cases with Deodans that really help us understand how people lived or the values of objects. Recent scholarship has started to focus on the use of tools for understanding how peasants survived as the size of their land holdings decreased. And in particular, Jankin Myrdal and Alex Sapoznik have worked on spade cultivation and intensification of land use between 1000 and 1300, and they've shown that spades were an essential part of peasant life. But what's a spade worth? Well, fortunately, the value of a spade is mentioned when they're deemed Deodand. Here's a record. I just realized that I've been saying where the records are, but I haven't been putting up the references. If people want references for the cases I've mentioned, just please email me. So here you can see in this case where a gardener is digging under a wall. The wall falls on him. He dies. The value of the spade here is 1.5 pence. So this, I think, is very valuable information, particularly when you get more of them and you see this is what a spade was worth. Similarly, you can get a good idea of the value of pigs. Oh, we'll come back to that one. A good idea of the value of pigs. From 1240 to 1257, roughly, the average pig is worth 11.7 pence, I've calculated, and piglets about 6 pence. As I said, these figures might change slightly. I still have to go back over and check that I've recorded every single Deodand accurately. So don't quote me on these right now. But 11.7 pence for a pig between 1240 and 1257, and 6 pence for piglets. Likewise, mill wheels when they're valued alone, which is about 70% of the time, they're usually worth between 12 and 24 pence, or one or two shillings. And I think appraisals for these objects do really reflect their average values, unlike horses. So here are the value of horses from Deodans between 1240 and 1257. Demonstrated in two ways. Here they're just all listed out, and then here you can see, for instance, that there are 10 horses deemed Deodand that were valued at 24 pence. What can you do with figures like this? If you're wondering, the average value is 85 pence for a horse. But what you can do with this, what can you do with this? One thing you can is you can compare them to figures from earlier decades to see how things changed. To do so, however, you have to have just the Deodans valued separately. You can't have, the horse and the cart and the hay. So you can only focus on Deodans that are mentioned individually. And this greatly reduces the number of cases you can use. Nevertheless, here's a chart that might be useful for some people. As I said, the figures are accurate right now to the best of my knowledge, but they might slightly change. In the 1220s, the average horse was valued at 80 pence from, if you look at the Deodans. And this again might differ, say, if you're looking at household accounts or other sorts of records, but from plea rolls, the average horse is 80 pence. In 1220s, and from the 1240s to 1257, it's 85 pence. And then pigs, you can see they don't change much, 11.4 pence to 11.7 pence. Horse skins, so if you fall off a horse and say the horse dies as well, say you fall into a river and the horse falls into the river and the horse dies, well, the skin of the horse is deemed Deodand. And so this is 6 pence in the 1220s. It's roughly 9 pence 20 years later. Cooking vessels, 24 pence, and then about 17 pence from 1240 to 1257. The reduction in the price here is really interesting. It seems, and don't quote me on this again, but it seems that cooking vessels are not being valued as often. So in other words, you'll have earthenware vessels or other cheaper cooking vessels that are killing small children, for instance. Either they fall on someone or a child is scalded by something in them. And these objects aren't being valued. They'll just say they're not worth anything. And so I think this is the reason for the reduction in the price, but I still have to do much more research on this. And then finally, boats. You can see 22.5 pence to 63.5 pence. For the record, as I said, I don't think you can do much with the valuations for the horses and the boats. It's impossible to ascertain why some are worth so much more than others. However, objects like cooking vessels, spades, scythes, mill wheels, pigs, fishing nets, these shed valuable light on everyday objects in 13th century England, both their value and what's being used. And jurors, I think, would have presented plausible, if not accurate, values to the justices. They'd lie, probably, but I think they would be reasonable lies, though sometimes as I said as well, we saw in the one case, justices will note that people will even just switch an object. That's not necessarily a problem. At first, I considered this a problem, and then I realized, well, if they're switching the expensive horse for a cheaper horse that's more along the lines of what a horse would cost at the period, then it's good for my statistics in some ways, because it's getting rid of the high valued horses and bringing it to what they think is an average horse. It's a possible route for research, but it's still I've still put that to the side. I think the value of horses are just not something I can work with right now. So these comparisons are helpful with pigs, cooking vessels, and whatnot, and be especially useful when I've looked at all the Deodans in 13th century plea rolls, which I intend to do. And it'll also be useful for seeing how often people are trying to lie to coroners, how often values change, and just in a sense, just looking at the interaction between localities and the central government through the presentment of accidental deaths. I think these records can show a lot about that. Now, some people will want to see a value of total Deodans. Again, these figures, they could change, so don't quote me on these figures. I put this together quickly. Someone always asks me about, what are the total value of Deodans? How many Deodans were there? What are the average values? Well, for what it's worth, here's a selection. So you can see, for instance, in Essex, 1227, 17 Deodans compared to 27 in 1254. The total value is 762 pence in 1227, and this changes to 2418 pence in 1254. The average value increases twofold by 1254 for Essex. So you can see this can be useful in some ways. I'd want to be a little more sure of my statistics. I want to double check them before I publish this. But you can see, here is an average value of a Deodand at this period, and this is how the average value of Deodans change. And this might indicate something about wealth in the 13th century, peasant wealth. And you can see it this way as well if you want. So if you just look at, for instance, the heir from 1218 to 1221, the current cases I have 167, total value is 9,000 pence, average value is 54 pence, and then the range on the side. And you can see here just the change in the average value. I'm not sure how helpful these average values are right now. Again, I think it's good to kind of remove the horses and remove the boats and focus more on objects such as pigs and cooking vessels and knives. But still, for those who want it, here are the statistics I have so far. Where am I moving with this work? Well, after I finish with Deodans, I intend to move to confiscated chattels, fines and amercements, and household accounts. And the big one, I think, will be chattels. Collecting the value of chattels that the crown has confiscated will help me, I think, study living standards in 13th century England. They're never, or they're almost never itemized in my period. But the total figures for the period, if I can get thousands of them, which I can, the total figures for the period, I think, can give a good impression of overall peasant wealth and how it changes in the 13th century. And so this is something I'm working on right now. I've realized after having collected all of these Deodans that I should also have started collecting chattels. So when I'm confirming everything about Deodans, I'll be collecting chattel values at the time. So hopefully by this time next year, I'll have much more to say about Deodans in 13th century England. But for now, this will have to do. So thank you very much. Oh, and I should stop screen sharing here. There we go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duggan. That was absolutely fascinating. Very much enjoyed that. We will go ahead and open it up to questions. If you want to just raise your virtual hand or just speak up either way. Oh, I see Sean Baker is up first.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. I know you're not really concerned with the law, but Deodans raised some very interesting legal questions. The whole system is utterly puzzling. I mean, it's often said that Deodans are things which cause people's death. Clearly, that's not true. All sorts of things are being seized as Deodan, which in no sense caused people's deaths, like the fish in your boat. And then there's so much inconsistency. You know, if you're run over by a horse and cart, sometimes the wheel is seized, sometimes the cart as well, sometimes the load is in the cart, sometimes the horse, or you fall off a stationary horse and the load in the cart behind it is seized, sometimes it isn't. I mean, the only conclusion one comes to is that really this doesn't seem to be governed by law at all. It's a sort of area of complete discretion outside the law. What's the philosophical basis of that, for goodness sake? Or is it just so far back in the past that nobody asks the question anymore, but this is just what we do? And after all, you're seizing property from people who are wholly innocent, and yet it's not, seems, governed by principle. I find that very puzzling.
It is interesting, and it's kind of funny when it stops. I haven't much looked into why the practice stops, but it's my understanding that when people start to get hit by trains, for instance, it starts to become a big problem. There's a lot of value in that, and it's you're not just saying, oh, it's the horse, oh, and we'll add the wagon and the hay and whatever.
Well, then again, you have to decide: is it just the wheel of the train or the whole darn train? And then the engines. Well, that's the question.
I think the one way it does function well is it does work well in forms of patronage if it's a wealthy person who the king wants to keep happy. As a form of patronage, it can be good to just value, or have the justices just value, say, a saddle that someone fell off, or a horse. What's also peculiar about it, it's something Cynthia Neville has mentioned this. A lot of people have mentioned this. It's odd, if you fall from a boat, the boat's Deodand, but if you fall from a window, what's Deodand? And there are times, there is a case, I couldn't find it. I recorded it somewhere, but I haven't been able to go through all of my records yet. Just recently I found one where someone fell off. I can't remember if it was a bell tower or what, but something was deemed Deodand that had, as you say, nothing to do with the death, but they value it. And so, yeah, it's not governed by law at all, it seems, yeah. Thank you, yes.
Tom McSweeney.
Hi, Kenneth, I really enjoyed this talk. I had a question about, so when you sometimes see amercements or pardoned for the salvation of the king's soul, or for the salvation of the king's soul and those of his ancestors and heirs, and sometimes you see felonies pardoned for similar reasons, right? Like, so one of my favorite examples is Henry III pardons a couple of felons for the salvation of Louis IX's son's soul after he dies, and things like that. So it's actually transferable. And do you ever see that kind of language show up with Deodans that would give you some idea of whether whose soul the Deodand is being given for? Is it for the soul of the person who is killed by the thing? Is it ever said to be for the salvation of the king's soul? And if Deodans are pardoned, do they ever use that kind of language with regard to the pardon? Like, does that show up on the rolls ever?
So the language usually says nothing. The Deodand is nothing. It's been pardoned through writ of the king. I haven't seen anything where they say in the plea roll that it's pardoned for someone's soul. I'm hoping, though, now that you mention it, I can probably find stuff like that once I start moving out of plea rolls. I hope, at least. But for the sake, in plea rolls, yeah, it really is just very much through writ of the king. And sometimes it doesn't even say through writ of the king. It'll just say it's been pardoned. Which is interesting, though, in that sense, that it does tell us when you find out, at the heir that something's been pardoned through writ of the king. It means that, the process has already happened. They're just recording this. But yeah, I'll definitely be looking into that, though. Thank you.
Yeah, when I've seen it, it's actually been on the plea roll. So yeah, it's curious that it doesn't show up in the case it did.
I'll definitely be looking for this then.
Sarah Butler.
Thank you.
So I think the patent rolls are where you want to go for that, Kenneth. The patent rolls are where you can find out what the king has decided to do with the Deodand, i.e. who he has donated them to. And sometimes it will say for pardoning a specific person's soul. Just throwing that in. And the other thing too is, you mentioned your cynicism, which I completely agree, i.e. all of this totally feels like a money grab, right? And I'm with you there. But I do think that some of this, it's not necessarily a money grab for the king's coffers. It's a money grab for the king's piety. So looking to the almoner to see what the king's almoner has done with all of this is the big part. Granted, that's still about money, right? Because the king needs to look magnanimous. He needs to look pious. Wouldn't it be nice to do that with somebody else's money instead of his own, right? And this is something to think about. Sorry, this is leading me into perhaps a little bit more obscurity, but England stands out because England is the only place that does this weird Deodand thing. Everywhere else, if a pig kills a child, the pig is put on trial.
Yeah.
Right? It's a totally different system, which again has always led me to, well, clearly in England, it's more about money because the Deodand at least gives the king money. But now you've thrown me off by telling me that bears are killing with intent.
Yeah.
So I about that. Are we seeing, like, when you say they're killing with intent, are they using the word felonice, or like, what the hell is going on here, Kenneth?
No, so I should qualify that. So it won't say they do it feloniously. What I mean is,
Okay.
It's kind of embarrassing. This is recorded. This is embarrassing. What I mean with intent is you'll find a lot of records where it'll say, someone falls from a horse or someone falls from a boat or a pig is digging under some object and it falls on a kid. And so in those cases, what's happening is just someone's in the wrong place at the wrong time. But there are other times, if you look at it from the perspective of the animal is in the right place at the right time because it wants to either eat a kid. Some of the cases are gruesome. There's one where the pig's just biting at someone who's sleeping in a raised, I forget what the term that's used, but they're raised up and the pig is biting at them through that. And so what I mean by intent is it was just trying to have some fun with it and saying, like, when a horse kicks someone, someone could be annoying the horse, or if a pig bites you, you could be annoying the pig, or if a bear bites you, leave the bear alone. It's usually not good to poke bears, but when they're doing it because they're attacking. And so that's what I thought was interesting about, it's one of the things first things I thought was interesting about looking at Deodans was, when people die, is it because it's their fault and they're doing something foolish, or are they just asleep and a pig bites them?
I'm just going to say, I think it would be really interesting to pay close attention to the animals that way. I mean, an animal is totally different than a ladder or a tree or a boat or anything like that, right? It would be interesting to see if they are according animals more agency in some of this and seeing them in a bit more European scope. Because surely England must have been aware that they were doing this far differently than the rest of Europe. And I don't know, it would be interesting to see if some of those ideas seeped into the law.
Thank you, yeah.
And by the way, I really appreciate all the parental advice. I'll move the pigs out of the house.
Yeah, pigs, bears as well. Like, don't keep a bear in the house.
Ian Williams.
Thanks. Thank you very much for that. I was going to ask about animals as well, but from a slightly different perspective, which is you've got that really massive variation in the value of horses. Do you see the same kind of thing with other animals with smaller samples? Because I'm just wondering if they're pricing in character, untrainability, this pig is homicidal, as a reason why certain animals might be seen as having lower value than others. So you can understand that in a way you wouldn't for, let's say, a boat. A boat is a boat, maybe varies in size, but there's less variation. I'm just wondering if that might be something to look into, or you can't do it because of the sources.
I think so. I can. I think if I'm using, for instance, household accounts and some other records, manorial records, I can perhaps start to see what type of objects for horses in particular. Say, when it says a horse is 4 shillings as opposed to 4 pence. I think that'll indicate what it is actually worth, or why. Who has the horse. In the records I have, though, it doesn't usually indicate anything other than just, fell from a horse and died. But I think you're exactly right. That's what's behind the valuation is, is it trained? Is it broken in? Is it a big horse? Whose horse is it as well? Even it could be a brutal horse or bad horse, but it could belong to someone who's very wealthy, and that might make the horse worth more money as well. So I do think that that's part of it. With the plea rules, I don't think I can get at that. But when I start looking at, in Buckinghamshire, for instance, and I think I can really look at a lot of manorial records for this, and in Yorkshire as well, and household accounts for the upper echelons of society, if I can say that. I think this will then allow me to see, these are why these might be valued like that. But unfortunately, with the plea rules, I still can't get from the records why something's worth so much money.
David, sorry.
Sorry, I'm not sure.
Tom, feel free to go before me.
Well, no, I was just going to ask, I mean, this discussion of value all supposes that the system is rational and that they are actually valuing things and not just raising money at random, which is what it seems to me to be doing. But I was going to ask, why do they value the things at all? It wasn't the thing forfeited, or is it valued in case the thing has disappeared?
No, it's valued, and so this is one of the things. It's along the lines of what Sarah Butler was saying here with the King's Almoner. It's money that's being money is usually handed over, and I think what's really happening is objects, especially animals, are being sold very quickly, and so that might bring the value down of animals because you don't want to have a horse or 6 oxen, for instance, that you have to care for. You want to
So
sell
the
that
object
quickly.
sold.
The object is sold or valued in ways. Sometimes it's not even clear if the object is sold. Sometimes people will get the object back.
Well, the
It
owner
might
can
seem.
buy it back, I suppose.
Yeah, and so
Yes.
I'm still working on that. It's very difficult, but I think I can get that answer in maybe another year or so. But yeah,
there might
definitely.
be all sorts of factors, like if you're taxing people who are wholly innocent, whose property happens to have been the occasion of someone's death, they might be considering whether it's fair to make them pay the full value, because you're actually taxing people irrationally. And so you might not be thinking, what is this thing worth, but what is the fair solution in terms of compensating the victim, but also not impoverishing or ruining the person who happened to own the thing.
Indeed, and it's the only really interesting, or the only really problematic thing with that is when the justices then start saying you brought the wrong object, or you didn't value it as much as it should be. And so they are clearly interested in getting a value of the object that did this, and seeing the real animal. And in some ways, I think, there is an element of, like, especially when it's a knife or something, did this actually happen? Where's the knife? Was this person killed? But on the other hand, I think it's like you're saying, it really is just, it is kind of a money grab. I am very cynical of it, but I'm becoming less cynical in some ways. I think what's happening is the object is being sold fairly quickly, and that money is collected by the sheriff, and then it's handed over afterwards. Usually collected by the sheriff and then handed over. And so it's not the object, which also makes it interesting then when justices want to see the object, like it's showing that they want to actually know, is this the actual object? Is this valued properly? And so, yeah, it's a good point though. Yeah. Thank you.
David?
Have you looked at geographical variations in the valuations? Because with the degree of capriciousness that we see, you might expect to see just a difference in, say, Kent and Essex.
So I don't have the figures put together, but I am collecting it like that. So I can see city versus rural in the north versus the south, for instance. I do notice as well in the north, the valuations for failing to do something can also be higher. They do seem to be punishing them more. It's something. One of the other things I'm working on. It's also linked to the project as well that I was working on originally, going to work on with Sarah Butler. The looking at escapes from prisons. So if you escape from a prison or say sanctuaries are supposed to be guarded, it's a £5 fine if you're in the south. But once you get to Derbyshire, Lincolnshire, and north, it's an £8 fine. And what's really interesting is I found a couple of years ago when I was looking through one of the rolls in Leicestershire. I think this is in my Limits of Strong Government. You can see that the clerk has actually written £8 when the guy gets to a £5 area, because he's just so used to writing it, and then he actually crosses it out and then puts £5. So they know what things should be valued at, and people in the north are being penalized for escapes. £3 more than people in the south, so £8 instead of £5. And this does it. I think I can't speak to this yet, but I think when I put the information together, both for financial penalties, for valuations of objects and whatnot, I think the north is being penalized more heavily. That's my impression right now, but I don't have the statistics to put together, or haven't put them together to back it up yet.
John? Did you have your hand up still? Sorry about that if I misread. Oh, I think you might be muted. Yeah, muted. Well, I'll go ahead and...
I don't know how to switch the hand off. It's my fault.
Not at all. I'll go ahead and ask a question or two, which won't be nearly as insightful as once you preceded it, but I'm interested anyways. Kind of following on David's question about kind of geographic analysis of it, but less in terms of valuation and more in just the number of deodans and immersements. Have you found these to reflect just the populations of the counties fairly directly, or do they seem to follow different patterns?
I haven't looked at that yet, but that is something. Actually, I hadn't even thought of that yet. I should say, that's something that I definitely want to look into now. Thank you. I haven't looked at that. That's a very good point. Just the population, because it's as it is with sanctuaries. In say Devon, there's a lot of churches there. So for instance, you might find more people fleeing to sanctuary, and in a rural area, you might find more oxen as opposed to say people falling from ladders. But I haven't considered anything with the population. Thank you. That's a really good point.
Then the one other question I did have was related to the case you had mentioned regarding the King's Wine and how that was pardoned by writ. And then the bear, which also seemed to be related to the King's property, which was not. Have you found all the cases that involve the King's property in some way to be pardoned fairly universally, or is that very?
They're not all. I haven't looked specifically, but I know that they're not all pardoned. I think this case was. What I think actually happened in this case is that they just kind of kept going. It was never valued. Probably they might have come up with a value at the time, but it's the King's wine. It needs to get somewhere. Don't hold it up to value it. And so I think that's what actually happened. But again, it's that thing. You can't really get behind the records to see this. It's all just speculation. And so, I think that King's objects would be deemed Deodand. This is just an instance where it wasn't.
Interesting. Do we have any additional questions? Oh, Frederica.
Sorry, I'm not very good at this technology thing. I'm just wondering, can you hear me, first of all?
Yes, yeah.
Yes, brilliant. I was wondering if you've looked at areas with private coroners or private jurisdiction, whether there's any difference, or whether if you've only looked at plea rolls, presumably you're not really looking at that yet.
I haven't looked at that yet, but that's something definitely that I'll need to do. The same with Durham. I haven't even looked at Durham yet to see what was going on there. But yeah, I definitely need to do that, and especially if I want to try to move into the 14th century with this, where there's a lot more records for this. That's something I definitely need to do. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
And Ian, did I see a hand or? Nope. Okay, perfect. Wonderful. Any additional questions before we wrap up? Oh, Sarah.
So I was just going to ask, Kenneth, do you have any plans to hook up with the National Archives currency calculator? Because theirs starts at like 1270 or 1280. And I only say this because I'm slightly obsessed with it, but so are my students. And for those of you who haven't tried it, it's, you put in a certain year, amount of money, and it tells you how far that money would go. And it's beautiful. But it's only beautiful once you get to 1270 or 1280. No idea what's going on before that. So I have a dream that you could fix this for them.
I can. I have, like from my PhD, I looked at over 100 plea rolls, and I have all the values from them. And that I confess I didn't know that they had a currency calculator, because I'm like 13 yeah. And then before usually, and so I didn't know this.
Beautiful. My students spend half their lives on there.
This is cool. I definitely will get in touch with them about this. National Archives currency calculator. That's what it's. Yeah. I kind of feel like instead of my talk, we should have just gone on there as a group and looked up objects. Thank you.
Fantastic. Any additional questions? Well, if we have exhausted our questions, I'll say thank you so much again to Dr. Duggan for an absolutely fascinating conversation, and to all of our audience members for their participation. I really enjoyed that. And then I will also just go ahead and mention that we will be back on the 8th of June at the same time at 3 o'clock for Professor Kim's talk on revisiting custom and legal. We very much look forward to seeing everybody there. So thank you all so much, and thank you so much again, Kenneth. That was really, really, really fun.
Thank you for your comments. They're really helpful.
Bye, everyone.